Galactic Council's demand fail, as Terran Empire strikes. The Vethri ambassador's secondary vocal chords hit the word surrender, and the sound went through the Senate chamber, like a bow drawn across a cello made of gravel, 17 limbs, pale gold membrane, stretched over a frame that had no right. Being that tall, it stood at the center podium where human senators had stood for 200 years, and it read from a document that had already decided our answer for us. I sat in the third row and looked at a crack in the floor tile. It had been there 11 years, a thin, diagonal split running from the base of the left aisle column toward the center. Drain, maintenance had patched around it. Twice, the patch was worse than the crack. I had filed a note about it in 2387, and nothing had come of it, and here it was still running its quiet diagonal, while Ambassador Velik of the Galactic Council read humanity its terms. 3 clauses. Disarm the Rift Fleet within 90 standard cycles, cede governance of the outer colonies to Council administration. Submit to full Council oversight of Terran Empire military, economic, and legislative functions effective immediately upon ratification. The ambassador used the word benevolent 4 times. I counted. The Kepler negotiators had used it 6. I did not let myself go further than that one sentence, one comparison. That was the amount of rope I gave myself. And then I pulled it back and looked at the crack in the floor again, and breath through my nose. Around me, the chamber was doing what chambers do when they hear things they do not want to hear. The young senators were already leaning forward, hands on desk surfaces, faces cycling through outrage and disbelief, and the particular kind of fury that comes from people who have never had to absorb terrible news quietly. Senator Finn Ackers, 31 years old and representing the New Auckland district, had gone the color of a brick wall. His jaw was moving slightly without producing sound. I watched the older senators instead. Senator Dale Hurst, 67 years old, born on Mars Station 9, second generation. Colonial, he sat with both hands flat on the desk and his eyes at a middle distance that had nothing to do with the room. He was listening, and he was calculating, and he was doing both of those things in complete silence. He had been building that kind of silence his whole career. You develop that quality from particular experiences, the kind you do not put in your official biography. He glanced at me once. I looked back. Neither of us said anything. We did not need to. Ambassador Velik continued. Its secondary vocal cords produced a harmonic undertone when it reached the section on compliance timelines, something between a hum and a deep purr that I suspected was meant to sound reassuring. It probably did sound reassuring to species that had always been the one setting the timelines. The chamber's air recyclers ran their cycle. Someone coughed near the back. Outside the high windows, the Terran Senate building's exterior lights had started their evening sequence, casting thin blue lines across the marble floor, crossing the crack without caring about it. The ambassador concluded its reading. It placed the document on the podium with a deliberateness that communicated finality. All 17 limbs settled into a posture its species used, according to the briefing files I had read that morning, to indicate patient expectation. It was the posture of something that had already moved on to thinking about what comes after. Yes, It asked if the Terran Senate had any questions. Senator Dale Hurst leaned forward. The room went quieter than it already was, which was an achievement. "Is that all?" he said. Not hostile, not sarcastic, just the question, clean and flat and carrying the particular weight of a man who had heard worse on worse days and still eaten breakfast after. The ambassador's membrane fluctuated. Its biometric sensors, which council diplomatic protocol required all ambassadors to wear openly as a gesture of transparency, registered something it would later describe in its official report to the council as an anomalous reading. The humans in the chamber had displayed no measurable stress response. The ambassador filed this under cultural idiosyncrasy. It would not be the last mistake. The session was recessed for 72 hours to allow the Senate to deliberate. Standard council protocol. Time for the weight of the ultimatum to settle. Time for the reality of 47 capital ships waiting at the edge of Terran territory to make itself known and felt and obeyed. I walked out through the main corridor. The building was old stone and new light fixtures and the smell of recycled air that had passed through too many human lungs on too many difficult days. My aide, Lieutenant Cord Webb, fell into stepped beside me and handed me a coffee. Without being asked, I took it. It was real coffee, not the powdered kind from campaign rations that stopped tasting like anything after the third cup. Real beans ground that morning from a small roaster in the capital district that I had been buying from for 9 years. I drank it and did not taste it. "Admiral Senator," Cord said. "Not yet," I told him. He went quiet, which was one of the reasons I kept him. The corridor was long and the evening light came through the side windows at a low angle, cutting sharp gold lines across the floor. Other senators moved around us, in clusters, in pairs, already talking, already building the arguments they would make in the deliberation sessions, already reaching for positions and frameworks and the machinery of political response. I walked to the end of the corridor and stopped at the window and looked out at the city. The Terran capital on a normal evening looked the way it always did. Lights coming on in the residential towers, transport lines running on their tracks, a cargo lifter ascending from the southern port district, slow and heavy, and indifferent to everything happening in the Senate chamber behind me. Hell of a thing. I had been 24 years old at Kepler, younger than Finn Akers was now. I had shaken hands in the formal accord gesture, and I had stood in the photograph they took afterward, and I had smiled the way you smile when you think the hard part is over. That photograph was in my desk, face down. I finished the coffee and handed the empty cup back to Cord without looking at him and started walking toward the briefing wing. 72 hours was not very much time. We had been preparing for 30 years. It was enough. The deliberation sessions ran for 3 days, and I spent most of them in the security briefing annex below the Senate floor, where the walls were thick and the air smelled like metal and the coffee was the powdered kind. I drank it anyway. The Senate floor deliberations were necessary, but they were not where the decisions were made. The decisions were made in rooms with no windows, around tables with no decorative elements, by people who had spent their careers building the infrastructure for a day they hoped would never come and knew probably would. I had been in those rooms before. The floor sessions were for the record, for the history files and the broadcast feeds and the senators who needed to stand and be seen standing for something that was not meaningless. Humans needed to see their representatives face a threat directly. It steadied them. I had no argument with it. But the work was underground. On the second day, Finn Akers cornered me in the corridor outside the annex. He was calmer than he had been in the chamber, but the calm was the surface kind, sitting on top of a great deal of pressure. We should send a counter-proposal, he said, a structured response. Show the council we are willing to negotiate the terms of a middle position. I looked at him. He was not wrong about the mechanics of the suggestion. It was a reasonable diplomatic instrument in a situation where both parties wanted a resolution that did not involve the other being destroyed. Counter-proposals worked when the party making the demand believed the other party had the right to refuse. You negotiate with someone who believes you have the right to refuse, I said. He waited for more. They don't, I said. He started to answer and I walked past him, not dismissively, just done with that branch of the conversation. The crack in the Senate floor was on my mind again, which meant I was circling something I did not want to name. Directly, I had learned to read that habit in myself over the years. Crack meant I was holding something at a distance that wanted to be closer. Kepler. The word sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. We had done the math at Kepler. The math did not change because the faces did. On the third day, the Senate voted. I had seen Senate votes before. The ones on budget allocations and territorial dispute resolutions and the colonial infrastructure bills that took 3 years to pass and changed very little. Those votes had a particular texture to them. People voted and the room moved on to whatever came next. This vote had a different texture. The chamber was full, every senator present, no proxies. The gallery above was sealed per security protocol, which meant the only people in the room were the ones who were required to be there. The air felt used, like it had been breathed too many times before being recycled. Senator Dale Hurst cast the first vote. He did it the same way he did everything, flat, quiet, without performance. The vote registered on the display board and the room silence shifted into something complicated. The young senators voted with their whole faces, meaning they made eye contact with each other before they pressed their confirmations, meaning they voted in the full awareness of being observed. Finn Akers voted with his jaw set and his eyes forward and the brick wall color still sitting under his skin. I voted and did not look at anyone. 214 in favor of formal refusal. 3 opposed. I did not know who the 3 were. I did not look for them. They were not villains. One of them, I heard later, wept quietly in their seat after the board cleared. I understood that too. The silence after the vote was not the silence of relief. It was the sound of a door closing. I had heard that sound before. You do not forget it. It has a particular quality, the silence after a door closes. On a world where the options were different, everything after that silence exists in the new world where the options are what they are. Senator Hurst caught my eye across the chamber. I nodded once. He nodded back. The official Terran response to the Galactic Council was drafted by a team of 7 and reviewed by 12 and approved by me and Senator Hurst in a room with no window at 11:00 in the evening on the third day. 17 words. I wrote the last 2 myself. The transmission was sent to Ambassador Velox's diplomatic vessel at 11:43. The vessel was in standard orbital, holding position 300,000 km above Terran. Primary far enough for protocol, close enough to monitor. I was told later that Velox received the message, read it, and then read it again. Then the ambassador called for its senior diplomatic staff. I was also told by a source I trusted completely that the meeting lasted 4 hours. Velox's biometric readings during that meeting registered outside normal diplomatic parameters for the first time in its 30-year career. I filed this away. The deliberation period ended. The Council received our refusal and the 17 words and the knowledge that the Terran Senate had voted 214-3. Somewhere in the Council's strategic planning apparatus, in the chambers and meeting rooms and command centers of 5 allied species who had never been prey, someone looked at the vote numbers and the response transmission and said something about resolve, and someone else said something about inevitability, and the fleet orders were prepared. I was in the briefing annex when Cord came in with the confirmation. 47 Council capital ships had begun fold approach toward the Terran territorial boundary, estimated breach in 31 hours. Council enforcement fleet under direct Council charter authority, no advance declaration of engagement beyond the original ultimatum, which they apparently considered sufficient. Cord stood and waited. I drank the powdered coffee. It tasted like nothing, which was fine. I had been drinking coffee that tasted like nothing since 2369, and I had long since stopped requiring it to taste like anything. I set the cup down. Get me Captain Owen Bray on the unconditional, I said, and tell Colonel Nina Holt I need the deployment board updated before I arrive. Cord moved. I sat for one more moment in the room, with no windows and the metal smell and the bad coffee. The Rift fleet had been in position for 11 days. Not at the Rift corridor, that was not where we had put it. 30 years of building something changes what something can do. And GT snorts. And GT, 30 years of studying how the Council thought, how it thought, what it assumed, what it never bothered to question, because it had always been right. 30 years of watching and measuring and preparing in the way that people prepare, when they understand that preparation is the only variable they can control. We had not built the Rift fleet to defend the Rift corridor. We had built it to be somewhere the Council would never think to look for it, until it was no longer useful to know where it was. I stood up and put on my uniform jacket and picked up the briefing files. The 17 words of our official response ended with a single word: the Council would spend the next 31 hours underestimating. The word was already. The Council enforcement fleet came out of fold space at 600 station time, 47 capital ships in a spread formation that their doctrine called the Embrace. It was designed to create a wide sensor net while simultaneously projecting force across the approach corridor. It had worked against the Sinvari in the Purge campaigns. It had worked against the Drell Collective. It had worked against every species the Council had ever needed to bring into compliance. I watched the fold emergent signatures on the tactical display from the bridge of the unconditional 47 ships. I had told High Command to expect 50. I had been close. Captain Owen Bray stood at the adjacent station, not speaking, watching the display update. He was 43 years old and had been commanding fleet vessels for 12 years. And he had the quality that the best command officers develop, which is knowing exactly when a room requires silence and holding it without effort. The Council fleet settled into its formation. Fold drive cycling down, shields expanding to operational range, sensor arrays sweeping the rift corridor. Approach. They were sweeping it very carefully. There was nothing to find. Colonel Nina Holt appeared at my left shoulder. They have completed emergent formation and brace as projected, beginning active scans of the corridor. How long before they register the corridor as empty? 12 minutes at their scan cycle speed. 12 minutes is a long time on an active bridge. I spent it watching the display and thinking about the crack in the Senate floor and not thinking about it at the same time, the way you do with things that keep returning regardless. The Council fleet's doctrine was written into everything they did. Declare, advance, give the opponent time to process their situation. The accord of measured force, which the Council had written 200 years ago and enforced consistently since, operated on an assumption so deep that they had stopped knowing it was an assumption. The assumption was this: the opponent always waited. The opponent waited because the opponent was afraid. The opponent was afraid because the Council was large and old and had never lost. The waiting was built into every model they ran. Their scan cycles assumed it, their formation spacing assumed it, their entire strategic framework assumed that when the Council fleet arrived, the thing it came to threaten would be in the place it was supposed to be, doing the thing afraid things do. The Terran Rift fleet was not in the Rift corridor. It had not been there for 11 days. At minute 9, the Council flagship began transmitting queries on standard diplomatic frequency. Where were the Terran defensive positions? Where were the response vessels that should have been scrambling to intercept? The corridor was clean. The sensors showed nothing but empty space and background radiation and the existing navigation buoys that marked standard transit lanes. At minute 11, one of the Council support vessels registered what it classified as a sensor anomaly in the approach corridor. A single Terran probe drone sitting quiet in the sensor shadow of a navigational buoy running on minimal power draw. The drone activated when the support vessel scan hit it directly. It broadcast on all frequencies the 17 words of the official Terran Senate response, read by a voice system in clean standard Galactic common. The last word was already. Then it shut off. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds in the Council fleet's communication traffic. And GT snorts. And GT Cord, who was monitoring their broadcast frequencies from the signal station, held up one finger, then 2. Then 42 fold emergent signatures lit up on the display simultaneously. Not from ahead, not from the rift corridor. From behind the Council fleet, from 6 points around its flanks, from the space between its own ships. The Terran Rift fleet had been waiting in fold compressed transit lanes, holding Position at minimum power output for 11 days. The Council's embrace formation scan had been looking outward. It had not looked at the space between its own ships. No opponent had ever used that space before. We had been practicing. The fold signatures resolved into emergence points so close to the Council formation that 3 of their vessels registered Terran ships at collision warning distance before their tactical systems understood what was happening. The Veth-3 flagship tried to turn. You do not turn a capital ship of that class in that formation spacing. They tried anyway. Fold signatures, 42 emergence points. 3 Council ships gone before there. Communications cleared the fold lag. 2 more catching Terran targeting lock before their shields finished expanding. The embrace formation, designed to project force outward in a wide net, had become a cage with the door locked from outside. I watched the tactical display. Clean geometry, lines intersecting. Force values resolving into outcomes. I felt nothing I would let myself name. Captain Bray was directing his bridge crew in a voice that was 3 degrees quieter than normal command volume. Quiet meant things were going the way they were supposed to go. Loud came later when they did not. Things were going the way they were supposed to go. Colonel Holt called out position updates, targeting confirmations, shield penetration data on the Council ships that were attempting to form a defensive cluster. 2 of the Council's Herrick class destroyers had broken formation and were attempting a fold jump, which required 40 seconds of preparation cycle. We had studied their fold prep cycle for a long time. We had designed a specific response for it. The destroyers did not complete their fold prep. The engagement lasted 19 minutes. At minute 17, the Council fleet's emergency broadcast began. A ceasefire request filed under Accord of Measured Force Protocols, Standard Language, the Council flagships. Identification codes, the engagement. Date stamp, the formal request for cessation under Article 9 of the Accord. Article 9 was the clause for when one party had established decisive force superiority and the other party formally acknowledged it. It was the Council's own language, their own law written by them for situations they had always assumed would involve someone else standing where we were standing. I authorized the response before they finished transmitting. The response was acknowledged. Nothing else. Cord looked at me from the signal station. He had an expression that I had learned to read as a question. He was not certain he was allowed to ask. Log the engagement, I said. Full record, no omissions. He turned back to his station. The tactical display updated. The Council fleet was holding position. Weapons offline per Article 9 protocol. Shields at minimum maintenance level, 47. Ships reduced to 29 operational, 18. Hulls at various degrees of damage. 3 non-recoverable. We had lost 2 ships. Both crews had been recovered. Owen Bray came to stand beside me. He looked at the display for a long moment. He was the kind of man who looked at things completely before he said anything about them. They thought we would be at the corridor, he said. They always think we are where they left us, I said. He absorbed that. What now, he asked. I looked at the display. 29 Council ships in an Article 9 hold, the most powerful enforcement fleet the Galactic Council had assembled in 40 years. Sitting quiet in space, It had entered 47. Ship strong. Behind me, somewhere in the signals. Traffic that cord was sorting through. Message had come in on a non-standard frequency, not Council, not Terran. Military. Sinvari origin code. I had not opened it yet. Now we go to work, I said. The counteroffensive was not a battle. Battles are things that happen. They have start points and end points and a shape you can put in a report. What we launched in the 36 hours following the engagement at the Rift Corridor approach was not a battle. It was a condition. Something that existed now in the space the Council had operated in for 200 years, the way weather exists in atmosphere, present, systemic, working at every level simultaneously. I authorized the first 12 operations from the bridge of the unconditional at 800 the morning after the rift engagement. My eggs were powdered, my coffee was real. I ate the eggs first, which was a habit from campaigns when the hot food went cold faster than the coffee, and you learned to prioritize accordingly. Cord brought the authorization queue. I signed 12 orders in 11 minutes. The orders covered 4 star systems. The Terran Empire strategic response had been built around a specific logic. We were not going to chase the Council's fleet assets from engagement to engagement. Fleet engagements favored the larger force over time, and the Council could field more ships than we could on a sustained production basis. We were not going to win a prolonged fleet war. We were going to make the prolonged fleet war impossible to have. The Council enforced its authority across the galaxy through infrastructure, communication relay networks that moved orders and intelligence and trade, agreements between member worlds, supply depot chains that kept enforcement fleets operational over long distances, the administrative hubs where Council governance decisions were processed and distributed to the territories under Council jurisdiction. These were not civilian targets. I said that twice. Once to myself, looking at the authorization queue, once to Colonel Nina Holt, who was standing at the operational board when I said it and who did not respond immediately. Her pause was 2 seconds long. I noted it. The relay networks are military infrastructure, I said, completing the thought I had started for both of us. Yes, Admiral Senator, she said. She turned back to the board. I turned back to the eggs. They were not civilian targets. Relay networks moved enforcement orders. The supply depots kept enforcement. Fleets armed and fueled. Administrative hubs coordinated Council authority over member worlds that had not chosen Council membership in any meaningful sense of the word chosen. Taking them offline was not an act against civilian populations. It was removing the mechanism by which centralized power projected control over a volume of space so large that the control only worked because no one had ever made it expensive. We were going to make it expensive. The first operations hit 4 relay stations simultaneously in the outer Council territories. Clean work, no crew casualties because the relay stations ran on automated systems with rotating maintenance crews of 12 to 15, and we had timed the operations to maintenance crew transit windows. The stations went dark. The maintenance crews were picked up by Terran recovery vessels and transferred to holding status. Within 6 hours, a section of the Council's communication network the size of 3 star systems had gone silent. Within 18 hours, 3 supply depots in the mid-territories had been seized and their contents transferred to Terran fleet vessels. Within 36 hours, the Council's ability to coordinate enforcement operations across its outer territorial range had dropped to 30% of normal operational capacity. I was signing the next authorization Q when Cord brought me the Santuum message. I had been putting it off, not because I did not want to read it, because I knew the shape of what it would contain, and I wanted to eat the eggs first and drink the coffee first and exist for a few more minutes in the operational framework where the work was clear and the outcomes were measurable. I opened it. The message was short. We told them what you were, they thought. We were being poetic. I read it twice. Then I put the reader down and looked at the operational display. The Santuum were a non-council species, small territorial range. Technologically capable, historically cautious, they had existed within Council territory long enough to understand what the Council was from the inside. They had told the Council at some point in some negotiation we had no record of what humanity was, what we were building, what we were capable of. The Council had found this observation charming, apparently. I sat with the message for 6 seconds. 6 seconds is a long time on an active bridge. Cord noticed. Owen Bray, who was at the tactical station, noticed. Neither of them said anything. I filed the message and picked up the authorization queue and kept working. The Council's next move came on day 4. An emergency diplomatic broadcast transmitted on the highest priority frequency in Galactic Common, addressed to all species within Council territory and beyond. The Council was invoking emergency charter authority, a call for unified galactic response. Any species with fleet assets, any species with strategic interest in maintaining the accord of measured force was requested to contribute to a collective defense of Council authority. The broadcast was well written. It invoked history and shared prosperity and the dangers of allowing one species to operate outside the framework that had kept galactic civilization stable for 2 centuries. 14 species received the broadcast. 3 joined the coalition within 24 hours. Small fleet contributions, mostly patrol-class vessels, but the political signal was clear. The Council was not standing alone. 11 declined. 2 of the 11 sent private communiques to the unconditional, addressed to me personally. I read both. I filed both. I did not share their contents with anyone. What I will say is that they were not messages of encouragement or of neutrality. They were messages from species that had been in Council territory long enough to have their own math, their own accumulated calculations built over decades of careful observation. They had been watching the rift engagement data that was by now cycling through every intelligence network in the galaxy, and they had made a decision about which way the door was closing. The 3 species that joined the coalition contributed 41 additional vessels to a reformed enforcement fleet. Combined with the surviving Council ships from the rift engagement, the total force was now 68 vessels. We had anticipated between 60 and 75. I had told High Command to plan for 75. Day 6, the reformed fleet attempted to establish a defensive cordon around the Council's home system, standard military Logic, protect the command center. Establish a hardened defensive position. And force us to come to them on unfavorable terms. We did not go to them. We went to the routes they needed to. Maintain the cordon. Every fold transit lane within 30 light hours of the Council's home system has relay infrastructure, navigation beacons, emergency resupply points, the technical architecture that makes large fleet operations sustainable. Over time, we did not attack the cordon. We took the architecture. Within 48 hours of the cordon's establishment, the Council fleet was operating on internal fuel reserves. Within 72 hours, 3 of the coalition contribution vessels had broken off and returned to their home territories. The math had shifted, and they had read it clearly. On day 8, we deployed the fold denial array. The fold denial technology was not new. The theory had existed for decades. We had been building the hardware for 6 years in a construction facility that existed in no Council intelligence file, because we had built it inside a planetary system listed in the Council's survey records as uninhabited and geologically unstable. It was, in fact, geologically unstable. We had built the facility on the stable part. The array went active at 300. It created a fold interference field across the approach routes to the Council's home system, not a physical barrier. Resonance disruption that made fold transit through the affected zone produce unpredictable results ranging from severe navigation error to complete drive failure. The Council fleet could not fold in or out of the zone. They were not under siege. They were simply unreachable. I had written that distinction into the operational order myself. It mattered. Siege implied we were trying to force them into submission through deprivation. The fold denial was not about submission. It was about isolation, about removing the Council's home system from the operational theater. The same way you remove a variable from an equation cleanly without excess. Everything the Council attempted to coordinate from that system now stayed inside it. Everything we did in the rest of the galaxy proceeded without Council interference. On day 9, I went to my cabin for the first time in 4 days to sleep. Cord had left a briefing packet on the desk. Beside it, transferred from Senate personal effects storage when I had come aboard the Unconditional, were the contents of my Senate desk. Protocol required personal effects to travel with senior Senate military personnel during active operations. The photograph was there, face down. I did not turn it over. I put the briefing packet on top of it and sat down on the bunk and looked at the wall for a few minutes before I slept. The wall of my cabin on the Unconditional was gray steel plate with a small viewport. Through the viewport there were stars, and the operational theater and the fold denial array running its field across 3 star systems. I had been 24 at Kepler. The girl in that photograph had shaken hands in the formal gesture and smiled, and believed the hard part was behind everyone now. I was not angry at her for that, but I could not look at her face right now either. I slept for 4 hours and 40 minutes. When I woke up, Cord was at the cabin door with coffee and a new authorization. Q. The coffee was real. I drank it and tasted it this time. That was different from the days before. I noted it without knowing exactly what it meant and put on the uniform jacket and went back to work. The council chamber was larger than I expected, not the size of the room. I had reviewed the architectural surveys. I knew the dimensions. What I had not been able to calculate from surveys was the specific quality of the space, which is that it had been built by people who believed they would always be the ones asking the questions. The ceiling height, the width of the approach corridor, the scale of the central podium and the surrounding delegate seats, all of it was calibrated to make whoever stood at the center feel the weight of the room's attention pressing down from above. I had been on the receiving end of rooms like that before. I had also been in worse rooms for worse reasons. I walked to the center and stood in the position the architecture was designed to make feel small, and I looked at the assembled delegates of what remained of the functional Galactic Council, and I thought about the crack in the Senate floor. No equivalent crack here. The council's floor was seamless, maintained to a standard that removed any sign of age or where. They had the resources for that. They had always had the resources for that. The new ambassador was a Harak, secondary, one of the species that had originally joined the coalition against us and then quietly withdrawn its vessels on day 4 when the Cordon math changed. Its formal name translated roughly as Vixari. I would call it that. It stood with measurably less confidence than Velak had stood in our Senate chamber 3 weeks earlier. That was noticeable. Senator Dale Hurst sat in the Terran delegation section to my left. He had made the transit from Terran primary specifically for this session. He had not said much during the journey. He sat now with both hands flat on the desk and his eyes at the middle distance, and that quality of silence he had spent 67 years perfecting. Cord was at my back holding the document case. The chamber had council delegates from 11 species. 3 of them I recognized from intelligence profiles, had been part of the original coalition against us. 4 had declined the coalition invitation. 4 were species I was meeting for the first time, which told me the council had expanded its consultation to include members it had not historically bothered to consult. Progress of a kind. Vixari opened the session in formal Galactic Common and asked the Terran delegation to present its terms. I did not have a prepared speech. I had 3 clauses. I read them from the document Cord handed me, not because I needed to read them, but because reading from a physical document in a treaty session established that the words were fixed and not subject to interpretation. I had learned that at Kepler too. The first clause, the outer colonies were sovereign Terran territory, permanently under full galactic law. Recognition, no council administration, no oversight mechanisms, no compliance requirements. The border was the border. The second clause, the accord of measured force, was dissolved. In its place, the Terran doctrine of proportional certainty was established as the governing framework for Terran external engagement. Proportional, meaning the council could determine the scale of any Terran response by the scale of their own actions first. Certainty, meaning there would always be a response. The math was simple and it was permanent, and it was not a threat. It was a description of reality. The third clause, a seat for the Terran Empire on the Reformed Council, which would be rebuilt under a new charter, with equal voice representation for all member species regardless of fleet size. or territorial range. One seat. Not a controlling position, not a leadership role, not governance. Authority over other species or expanded. Territorial claims. One seat at the table. Vexari absorbed the 3 clauses. It conferred briefly with the delegates on either side of it. The conference was longer than it needed to be, which meant they were not conferring about the terms. They had read the terms in advance. Everyone in this room had known these terms for 3 days. They were conferring about something else, about what it meant that the terms were what they were. Vexari addressed me directly. The Terran Empire requests only a single seat, it said, not governance authority, not territorial expansion beyond the outer colonies. Why? I looked at Vexari for a moment. Because we do not want to run it, I said. We just want you to remember we could. The room did a thing. I had seen rooms do this thing before. It is the particular movement that happens when a group of people receives a sentence that is simultaneously very clear and very heavy. The weight of it travels around the room in waves. Some people absorb it and sit with it. Some people need to look at other people to confirm they heard what they heard. Vexari conferred again. The conference was shorter this time. The session proceeded to formal ratification. The Council's legal apparatus is thorough, and it was not going to be anything less thorough today, simply because the circumstances were unusual. Document review, formal reading of each clause, delegate acknowledgement, authentication protocols. It took 2 hours and 16 minutes. I stood at the center podium for most of it. The ceremonial signing instrument was a Veth-3-made device, the traditional form used in all Council treaty sessions for 2 centuries, designed for Veth-3 limb geometry, 17 limb grip, which meant it was shaped for a hand structure humans do not have. I held it wrong. There was no correct way to hold it with a human hand. I held it in the way that seemed least likely to drop it and signed where indicated. While the pen held wrong was still in my hand, it arrived. Not during the vote, not during the reading of the terms, not during the long procedural stretches of the ratification session. While the pen was in my hand and the document was beneath it and the room was quiet with the particular quiet of something being permanently finalized. 30 years. She had been 24 at Kepler, standing in the photograph with the formal handshake and the smile that believed the hard part was behind everyone now. The delegation, both human and Veth. 3, looking at the camera with the shared expression of people who had just agreed on something they thought would hold. She had been wrong about the hard part, but she had not been wrong about everything. She had believed at 24 that there was a version of this that eventually ended at a table with documents with acknowledgement of terms freely given. She had believed in the table even when everything that came after Kepler gave her substantial reasons not to. She had kept the photograph. Even face down, she had kept it. I handed the pen back to Vexari and thanked it and turned and walked toward the exit of the council chamber. Senator Hurst fell into step beside me. We walked the full length of the approach corridor in silence. The corridor was long and the ceiling was high and the architecture was still doing the thing it was designed to do. I felt it and walked through it and came out into the transit hub where the Terran shuttle was docked. At the end of the corridor, Hurst stopped Hell of a thing, he said. He was the first person who had ever used my own phrase back at me. He had clearly been carrying it for a while, waiting for the right moment. I looked at him. Yeah, I said. We walked to the shuttle. The transit back to the unconditional took 40 minutes. Cord met me at the hangar bay entrance with coffee, real coffee, and the day's signals traffic summary. I took the coffee and started walking toward the command section, reading through the summary as I moved. 14 items, standard operational traffic, fleet redeployment confirmations, 3. Administrative communications from the Senate, 2. Intelligence updates from the outer territories. At the bottom of the queue, flagged with a non-military origin code, was a communique from the Senvari Free Worlds. Formal header, official government seal. Addressed to Admiral Senator Mara Vass. Terran Empire by name. I stopped walking. Cord, who had been a step and a half behind me, stopped too. I read the message. It was short, 4 sentences, which was characteristic of Senvari formal communication. They did not use more words than necessary, and they had spent enough time inside Council territory to understand what happened when language was imprecise. The first sentence acknowledged the outcome of the Terran Council engagement. With a formal Senvari term, I had to look up in the translation guide. The term meant something in the vicinity of resolved in the expected direction, which in Senvari diplomatic usage carried the implication that the speaker had already accounted for this outcome in their planning. The second sentence referenced their earlier communique, the one that had arrived during the campaign. We told them what you were. The third sentence was this: we have also been practicing. The fourth sentence was a formal request for bilateral diplomatic talks on Senvari terms at a location of mutual agreement at my earliest convenience. I read the message twice. Then I closed the reader and held it and thought about what I was holding. A species that had watched us for however long they had been watching. Species that had told the Council what we were and been filed away as overly dramatic. A species that had in their own parallel way and over their own equivalent of however many years been building something, preparing for something. We have also been practicing. Cord was still waiting. I put the reader in my left breast pocket and started walking again. Tell them, I said, we will be in touch. Cord made a note and fell back into step behind me. We walked the length of the command corridor and took the lift to the senior deck, and I went to my cabin and sat down at the desk. The briefing packet from the night I had last slept was still there. Beneath the briefing packet, the photograph. I moved the briefing packet. I sat and looked at the photograph face down for a long moment. The photograph had lived face down in various desks for 11 years, in the Senate desk on Terran Primary, in the field desk on the Kestrel during the border campaigns, in the cabinet aboard the Harrow when I was running the Northern Patrol rotations. It had moved with me from posting to posting, always packed, always positioned the same way. Face snorts down, not thrown away. I thought about that for a moment, about what it means to keep something you cannot look at, about the specific quality of grief that does not resolve and does not leave and simply becomes part of the furniture of a life present in every room, always facing the wall. I turned the photograph over. The image was old. The resolution was The standard quality of 2369. Documentation slightly soft at the edges, the color balance of that era's recording technology giving everything a faint warmth it may or may not have deserved. The Kepler delegation in a room that had seemed historic at the time, human senators and military liaisons in formal dress, Veth 3. Diplomats in their ceremonial configuration. Everyone facing the camera in the way. People face cameras when they believe the moment deserves to be preserved. She was standing forth from the left, 24 years old. The formal handshake pose was done, and her arms had relaxed to her sides, and she was smiling the unguarded smile of someone who had not yet understood what understanding costs. She was not wrong, she was young. There is a difference, and it took me a long time to know it. I put the photograph on the desk face up and finished the coffee. Real coffee, and I tasted every bit of it. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same stars they had always been. The fold denial array was no longer active. The Council's home system was reachable. Again, 47 Terran fleet vessels were redeploying to standard patrol formation across the territories that had previously been under Council enforcement jurisdiction, now under the shared governance framework of the Reformed Council, one permanent seat of which belonged to us. The Sinvari had been practicing. I had no way to know for how long. I had no way to know what 30 years of parallel preparation looked like from inside a smaller territorial range with fewer ships and the specific difficulty of having been surrounded by Council space for their entire modern history. That would require a conversation. Several conversations. The kind that happened slowly and carefully between parties were taking the measure of each other for the first time with full honesty. But I knew what the word practicing meant when someone chose it carefully. It meant we saw what you built. It meant we understand the geometry of what just happened. It meant we have been doing our own version of this work, and we would like to have a conversation about what we do with it now. The galaxy was at this moment in the particular condition that follows large change. Things had shifted but not fully settled. The Council had been restructured but not dismantled. 11 species were recalibrating their positions in relation to a new reality. 3 species that had contributed vessels to the coalition were in various stages of reassessing their relationship with the Reformed Council. The 2 species that had sent me private communiques during the campaign were waiting to see what I did with what they had told me. The Sanvari were sending 4-sentence messages with very precise word choices. I had a desk. I had a photograph face up for the first time in 11 years. I had 1 seat on the Reformed Council. That I would occupy the same way I occupied everything, completely without performance and without any illusions about what rooms designed to make you feel small were actually built to accomplish. Cord knocked and opened the cabin door without waiting for my answer, which he only did when the timeline was real. Admiral Senator, Captain Bray requests your presence on the bridge. We have a fold signature emerging at the outer boundary Sanvari registry. Earlier than their message had implied, they had already been moving when they sent it. That told me something worth knowing. I stood up. Tell Owen I am on my way. I picked up the photograph and looked at it one more time. The girl at Kepler, 24 years old, arms at her sides, believing the hard part was over. Hell of a thing, getting everything you prepared for. I put the photograph back on the desk, face up, and went to the bridge.